Since a number of our Sierra Club Executive Committee people are here, I'd like to have them stand, so if you want to know more and ask any of them about it, a Sierra Club. We are very fortunate to have as guest speaker tonight Curtis from Oahu to speak on navigating Hawaii's energy future. He closely follows and participates in Hawaii's energy issues. He's been executive director of Life of the Land for 18 years. Life of the Land has been in 20 dockets at PUC, mostly as the only voice representing the community. Life of the Land has an amazing website with an array of information and lots of videos, and I highly recommend you go and learn more there. So I also want to invite you to join our Conservation Committee. We meet once a month in KL, 5:30, the fourth Wednesday of the month. And this next week, though, we are going to meet in HECO, and if you want more information on that, I have some slips of paper about that on the table there.
Lifelandhawaii.org.
Lifelandhawaii.org.
And so now I'm very happy to present to you.
Aloha. I'd like to thank the Sierra Club for inviting me to speak. I have an interesting background with them. In the 80s, I was doing a lot of door-to-door work in California on environmental issues. And in 1991, the club decided to see if they could expand their membership by going door-to-door. So I came down from the Bay Area to join 5 canvassers from LA. And we went out in LA, door-to-door, to work on membership expansion. And our first day was in Long Beach, which is an interesting community. And then later in the mid-90s, I served as both vice chair of Oahu XCOM and on the state XCOM for Sierra Club. I want to break down my talk on energy into 5 parts, and then spend about half the time in Q&A because the questions are really important. And often I find that the questions seem to get lost. People speak right up until like 30 seconds before the meeting ends, and there's no time for questions. I want to focus on 5 things on my presentation. First, on definitions. Second, on the history of the grid, the Big Island grid. Third, some Big Island energy issues. Fourth, the utility way forward. And fifth, Life of the Land's way forward. Definitions I find really fascinating because if you know of Einstein, he came out with a famous equation, E equals mc squared, which simply says that the entire universe is made up of energy and mass, and they're the same thing. So obviously, if you talk about renewable energy, and everything is energy, and you can't create it, and you can't destroy it, then how could you possibly have renewable energy? And the answer is, it's a man-made definition. And because it's made up by man, and because it's an artificial definition, it varies everywhere. So for example, in Pennsylvania, if you go into a coal mine and you capture the coal gas on site, you burn it on site, it's renewable energy, you ship it to a generator, it's fossil fuel. Crazy definition, huh? In Hawaii, if you take coal and burn it at a garbage to energy facility, it's renewable energy. If you burn it at a utility power plant, it's a fossil fuel. Biofuel is always renewable in Hawaii, no matter how it's made. So if you go to the Amazon rainforest and level it and monocrop palm oil and bring it to Hawaii to burn in our power plants, that's 100% renewable energy. So the utility is proud to say that we're increasing the use of renewable energy. That's not our definition of renewable energy. It's a definition that the fossil fuel industry has made. And so our definition is renewable energy is something where you're using a form of energy that can provide work for you, that can provide fuel, that can provide transportation, that can provide electricity. A usable form of energy where you're using it at a slower rate than it's being replenished. And it has a small footprint. It has a small environmental footprint, a small cultural footprint, a small economic footprint, a small social footprint. And so that's one key thing. The second key thing is how we define renewable energy in terms of, most people know that like sun is renewable, solar energy is renewable, wind is renewable, hydroelectric streams are renewable, and yet those are the inputs that make fossil fuel, because fossil fuel is basically dead plants. So fossil fuel is a form of solar energy. So definitions are important, and I find that the utility likes to save definitions to the last day. Meetings that I've always been at, they always want to define things the last day. They want to work generally on getting agreement and then telling you what you've agreed to. Now, the grid, the second part is really looking at the grid. In Hawaii, the electric grid that we have now is what we invented in the 1800s. You have a power plant, you have a transmission line, you send the power from the power plant to the transmission line to the customer. One-way flow. The utility knows how much energy is flowing on their transmission line, their big power lines. Once you get to a substation and begin sending it out into the community, the utility has no idea how much energy is on the line. That is why when a line goes down, they don't race to repair it until somebody calls up and says, I don't have power, what's wrong? And then they go and repair the line, because they have no idea what's going on the individual lines. They have no communication, no computers, no monitoring of the lines. And that presents a problem, because currently a lot of people are talking about adding solar to the grid. They're talking about adding solar power to the grid, net metering, where you put a solar panel on your roof and you have net metering with the grid. But the utility has no way of measuring how much energy you're adding to the grid. And when you're adding it to a distribution line, the power can flow in either direction. So suddenly they have a two-way electric flow, which is something they're not familiar with. Remember, this was designed in the 1880s, 1890s. So it's not a sophisticated system. And we're adding a lot of renewables to it, totally confuses them, totally boggles their mind on what's going on. That presents a real problem for them. And that presents a problem when homeowners try to add more renewables to the grid, because the utility right now has a rule that says only a certain amount of renewables can enter the grid. You're familiar with that? 15%. 15%. That's because they don't really know what's going on. And they're trying to be very cautious. The 15% came from California 30 years ago, where California said, I wonder if we could make it 30% renewable on the line. Oh, let's make it 15%, be safe. They guessed at the 30%, slashed it in half, and said that sounds reasonable. But they don't really know. And the problem that Hawaii is facing, unlike other, and I want to talk a little bit about intermittent energy. If I use the term intermittent energy, you know what I'm talking about. The sun sometimes shines, sometimes doesn't shine. Sometimes solar power works, sometimes at night it doesn't work. Sometimes wind energy works, sometimes it doesn't work. So intermittent means that you're having an energy source that only works part of the time. Whereas firm power is always available 24/7. Except at your house.
Except when it goes down.
It's going down all the time.
Right. So the problem the utility is facing right now is that they don't know the flows on the grid. They have a very poor understanding. And when people add intermittent wind or solar on, it confuses them. And therefore they have a whole bunch of firm power generators that are always on, that when people are pumping a lot of energy on, these sort of massive central station generators drop down to a low level and sort of rev, like teenagers at a stoplight, revving their engines, waiting for the wind or the solar to drop off so they can rev their generators up to offset the flows from the solar and the wind. And this is the way the grid is operating right now. The problem that we're facing is on the mainland, the sun peaks during the day. The maximum energy used on the grid occurs during the day. In Hawaii, our maximum use of energy occurs from 6 to 8 p.m. at night, when there is no sun, and it's the time of day that wind is least likely to occur. So it means that we have to have all of our baseload generators running at that 6 to 8 p.m. time. It means that no matter how much solar you put on the grid, and no matter how much wind you put on the grid, you still have to have the same amount of fossil fuel power plants, or geothermal power plants, to take care of that evening load. That presents a problem because if you have the same number of plants and they're running less hours each day, you have to spread their fixed costs over a fewer number of hours, so you're driving up the rate of fossil fuel. You're making fossil fuel electricity more expensive. And you now have the expense of the wind and the solar that you're putting on. So that's why your rates are going up, because the utility has to maintain all of their fossil fuel power plants while you're also maintaining your solar and wind. So the utility loves that. I mean, picture it. You get your solar, you get your wind, they get their fossil fuels, rates go up, they're happy. Because the higher the rates, the better off they are. So that's why they're talking about adding geothermal right now, because as people put in more solar and more wind, they have to be able to offset that. And geothermal works 24/7 all the time, and therefore they're putting it in to offset the wind and the solar. And so they're saying, you want solar? That's great. We need geothermal to balance it. Now that becomes a problem if you like solar and you hate geothermal, right? I take it a fair number of people hate geothermal. So what the utility wants to do to transform everything is what's called a smart grid. People here have heard the term smart grid? Smart grid means that every transmission line, every distribution line, every solar on everybody's roof that's creating electricity should be wired into HECO's central management system. So that HECO can look at a computer and tell the instant flow on every distribution line, on everybody's energy entering the grid, everybody's energy taking out of the grid, so they know what's happening everywhere on the grid. They say, if we do that, then we'll be able to better manage the demand and the supply, and be able to handle all these people who are putting in solar, or some people are putting in wind. Can you smell the dollar signs on that? It's very expensive. One, you have to measure the flow everywhere on the grid. Two, you have to have that data go real time back to your central computer. Three, you've got to be able to send data back to that node and turn on or off the power that's making disturbances on your grid. You've got to manage it all, and you have to make it all computer secure from hackers. So it's a multi-billion-dollar effort that the utility wants. They want a multi-billion-dollar grid upgrade, and they want geothermal in order for you to have your solar. Now, luckily, there's a way out of that. If you put in solar and battery so that you remove yourselves from the grid, then they don't need the smart grid. They don't need the geothermal. And in fact, you don't need them. They don't want that. So their entire effort is convincing you that the smart grid is the way to go. And our approach is to say, let's forget about the grid. Let's go beyond the grid. Now, a few summers ago, the head of the Arizona Public Service Commission, it's the equivalent of our Public Utilities Commission. And Arizona has a nice system because their public utilities commissioners are elected by the people. Ours are appointed by the governor. And their chair is elected by the members of the commission. Ours is appointed by the governor. And the chair of their commission said, what do you think is going to happen? At some point, the price of solar is dropping, and the price of grid-based electricity is rising. And at some point, the two are going to cross. At some point, the unsubsidized price of solar is going to be cheaper than the price of electricity off the grid. And at that point, people are going to start fleeing the grid. It doesn't make sense to stay on if you can make your own electricity, or you can pay more to the utility and maybe have electricity and maybe not. It's going to happen first in the state with the most renewable energy, the most variety of renewable energy, and the highest utility rates. Hawaii Island, Maui Island, Molokai, and Lanai will be the first 4 places in the United States where it will be cheaper to get off the grid than to stay on the grid. What the utility probably doesn't want you to know right now is that has already occurred for this island. That the price of solar and battery is actually cheaper than maintaining the grid, putting in the smart grid, and doing everything they want to do. That terrifies them. And yet, they have to tell the federal government what they're doing. They file yearly filings with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the thing that Mitt Romney is involved in, where he's told the SEC he's doing one thing, he's telling the public he's doing a different thing. HECO has to file these annual filings with the SEC, and HECO said in their latest filing with the SEC, we have to worry about the fact that people might start migrating off the grid, and it might put us out of business. They told the federal government that, because it's a risk they're facing, and they know that.
That was in that article that you wrote.
Yes. They filed it with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission in February, saying that they risk going under. And they know that. We met with senior members of Hawaiian Electric a few years back, and they said to us, we may not be here in the near future. And that was the same time we met the advertiser and the Star Bulletin. They each said, we may not be here in the future. One happened before the other, it's natural, and you don't expect them at the same time. So the utility wants to put in as much as they can, as fast as they can, so that if they get something, a capital expenditure approved by the Public Utilities Commission, then they can turn around to the government and say, but you agreed to this. And if it's no longer feasible, if people are no longer using it, you still have to bail us out because you approved it.
Too big to fail.
Right, so they want to put in the smart grid. They want to put in telecommunication systems everywhere. They want to be able to instantaneously monitor your energy use at every building, every customer, all the time. and they want to build an inter-island grid to tie it all together. And they want to build baseload energy as fast as they can. Right now on this island, the maximum highest use of energy ever was about 205 megawatts. Right now, the generators they have that are 24/7, they can go on all the time, about 270 megawatts. So they have 270 of capacity right now of power that can always go on, and they've never needed more than 204. And it's been going down for the last few years, the demand. So what did they ask the Public Utilities Commission for? 50 megawatts of new baseload generation for this island. Geothermal, for example. Same thing on Maui. Maui's all-time highest energy use was around 207. They have 270 megawatts of baseload energy, so they said we need another 50 on Maui also. And we need an inter-island cable in case we need to bring some of this to Oahu, which has too much power to begin with. But the idea is you spend as much money as fast as you can and you get the Public Utilities Commission to agree to it, and that way it will strand all of you to pay the bill. Now, the way to stop that is to get a utility whose mission it is to get you off the grid. You can actually have a utility which says, we will buy solar panels in mass, so they're cheap, so we can give them to individual solar distributors here on the island. We can install, we can put the money up front to people, because right now, if you pay off your bills on a solar system and somebody else is paying the upfront costs and your monthly payments are less than what you'd be paying to the utility for their power, you can have a utility whose sole purpose is to represent customers who want to leave the traditional electric utility. And one utility has already come in, Hawaii Electric, which is a funny name, Hawaii Electric. They now handle HECO's demand-side management program. So, for example, if you want Energy Star appliances or CFLs or something like that, that used to be supplied by HECO, but is now supplied by an independent utility that also reports to the Public Utilities Commission. So the demand-side management program was taken away from HECO, from NECO and HECO. So it's possible to also set up another utility whose purpose is to take customers off the grid. Now, what would be the benefit of taking customers off the grid? Well, the utility loves fossil fuel. The utility feels that climate change issues shouldn't be dealt with until the House and the Senate, the U.S. Congress can deal with it. As a safeguard, they've said they feel that the market should decide. They were the ones who favored using palm oil from the Borneo rainforest to power our grid. During the labor strike that occurred a few years ago, they publicized the fact that the labor was going on strike and hiding the fact that following the 2008 recession, where a lot of people were hurt economically, they boosted the pay, the short-term bonuses, the long-term bonuses, and other kinds of bonuses for their executives who, being millionaires, were hurting and needed sharp raises across the board. So the utility, and it's interesting because the utility has through what's called the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, and it's clever because the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative is based on clean energy, which is not defined by the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, and it's not defined in state law either. So the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative is anything they want it to be. That said, why don't we separate sales from revenue from the utility? Because revenue was decreasing each year. the utility said, we want to be guaranteed a certain revenue. So as people leave the grid, as people use less electricity, we can jack up their rates so our revenues stay the same. And the Public Utilities Commission said, that's a marvelous idea, let's do it. DBED, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism said, why don't we at least only give it to them if they achieve some kind of renewable energy stepping goals? And the PUC said, no, let's give it to them now. So it's passed. And now the utility is using their added revenue to fight expansion of net metering. Because net metering is something they don't like. Net metering takes money away from the utility.
Doing good.
So we're facing this issue, and there's, so now HECO wants two things. They want Puna and HECO, and they want to expand geothermal energy. And they want to expand those two to add more power than this island can possibly use, so they can put in a cable to Oahu and send it to us when we don't need it on Oahu. And I haven't figured that really out. I did point out to HECO several times that you have a single line bringing power into Oahu that has more than 200 megawatts flowing on it. You run a risk, because if something happens to the line and there's a sudden loss of power of 200 megawatts on Oahu, you'll knock out the grid. I mean, after all, when you guys had the earthquake, we got wiped out on Oahu. Our grid went down because we had a disturbance that was a sizable disturbance. So HECO wanted to bring in a lot of power on a single line to Oahu, such that if the line ever went down, it would be worse than the earthquake, and we lose all our power on Oahu in a shot. And they said that would be $1 billion to Maui. We're like, but you can't do that. You need 3 lines. And they were like, they recently said, okay, Henry, you're right, we need 2 lines. But of course, that would be $2 billion to Maui, $2 more billion to this island. You'd be putting $1 billion for geothermal. You'd be putting in Hilo. You'd be building massive wind farms, all making their energy more and more and more expensive. Well, if the price of solar is dropping and it's already past their current price of electricity, and they want all these capital expenditures and the smart grid, where do you think that's going to take us?
To the poorhouse.
It's going to take us to the poorhouse, and they're going to laugh all the way to the bank. So I think we're on the dead wrong path. I think we need to focus. I think we need to encourage as many people to leave the grid as possible. Why don't I open it up for some Q&A, and I'm sure there's some questions. And you ask the question, I'll repeat it and then answer.
The preponderance of geothermal capability on the Big Island appears to be in East Puna. The Hawaiian Volcano Observatory has already put out a paper indicating that investment in that along the East Drift Zone and the cable outlet, which would allow us to move that electricity, has a 60% chance in 50 years of being overcome by lava. So how are the government, Public Utilities Commission, and the government politicians, how are they reconciling that fact? Because if that's the case, since they would have a long-term loss of some large capability, they're still going to have to keep their fossil fuel capability in place in case there's a volcano that wipes out that capability.
Right. The question is, what happens if we invest in geothermal in Puna, and something goes wrong with the Puna geothermal plant, if it gets overrun by lava, of course, the flip side of that is you need more transmission lines across this state, across this island. You need to have additional high voltage transmission lines overhead from Puna to Kauai to bring it to Maui. So those cables could also have something happen to them. The utility would say, look at it this way, either it goes in and we're guaranteed our profit, or it doesn't go in and we can say we tried for renewable energy and failed. So either way, we're fine. And that's the way the utility is thinking about it. I should point out though, that the three members of the Public Utilities Commission that would be ruling on this have to each year file an annual financial disclosure statement that identifies where their income is, who's wining them and dining them, what junkets they're going on, and that kind of stuff. They have to file them each year, but state law forbids you to see them. The governor can see them and know how to lobby them, but you can't see them.
Okay, so just actually Wednesday, we had a county council resolution, I don't know if you read that, where to move the feeder rate to 100% from 15%, which is, it's actually 30% is what it is on the low rate. So actually, I'd like to, we're really working with the council a lot. It'd be great if we could get you to give this presentation to the county council.
The question is, can we increase the amount of solar on the distribution lines? The problem is that the answer is we can raise it to some extent, but the exact level we can raise it is unknown. Let me back up slightly. The Public Utilities Commission has created something called the Reliability Standards Working Group. It's a 25-member PUC appointed body that is looking at that. I serve on that. I've signed non-disclosure agreements. So some of that I can't discuss. But what I can discuss is there's a limit to the amount of solar or intermittent energy that can go onto the grid. And it requires that the utility put in telecommunication and computer monitoring of all the lines. So to really increase the amount of intermittent solar on the grid, you have to have the smart grid. If you have the smart grid, somebody has to pay for it. So it makes more sense to us to not seek to increase the amount on the line, but rather to seek people to get off the grid.
Well, I'd love you to give that presentation to the county because I support them.
Yes.
How does the grid appear compared to Hawaii and also California? Because they're able to have much more solar on their grid. So have they been upgraded, or what's the difference between the grids?
In the United States, there are four basic grids across the United States. Texas has their own. There's one that goes from Canada to Mexico along the west coast. There's one Canada down to the south in the middle, and there's an east coast one. So if you add solar, say, in Quebec, you can take the power out in Miami. So adding a little bit of solar in one place can be absorbed in a massive, massive system. That's not the same as this island, where you put in a little bit of solar and the amount compared to the amount on the grid is much higher.
What about Hawaii? They have 80%.
The difference is that this island has two major wind farms. And wind farms tend to fluctuate quite differently than solar. Solar, you can sort of tell when clouds are coming and when they're not. They tend to dip slowly a little bit. But wind can be full force and drop off very quickly. And the big wind farms can destabilize the grid. So we have a wind farm at South Point. We have a wind farm at Kabe. And those two tend to add a lot of intermittency to this grid. So when we add a lot of solar to the grid, utility, the way it's structured is they have to accept the solar on the grid. They don't have to accept the wind. So as a lot more solar comes on, the wind owners would see a sudden drop in their demand. They would see a sudden drop in their profit margins. And they would tend to get litigious. So that's not the problem on Kauai, because Kauai you cannot have a wind farm to the grid. Because of the bird situation, you cannot have a grid-connected wind farm on the island. So Maui and the Big Island are the two islands that have high amounts of wind energy relative to the total electricity on the grid. And added solar presents a problem. And the exact level is hard to determine.
Can I still one more question? So you're saying the solution is Hawaii Electric, the alternative utility company. What are they going to decide to, I mean, are they really doing, are they really?
Hawaii Electric is handling energy efficiency programs. You need another utility that handles generation. So focusing on getting people involved in producing their own generation and producing their own batteries, or having community power, like Puna. If Puna or Pahoa wanted to supply its own power, it could have a small grid for just Pahoa. It could have solar on a number of different facilities. You could have a little bit of wind on a number of systems, and you could supply your own power, and you could have a utility help coordinate it and help develop it. There are in Alaska a number of very small co-ops, energy co-ops, that have just a couple hundred members in them. And the co-ops have a national association that helps them all to work together. But you have very small co-ops that provide community power in very localized areas, so you don't need a massive grid and you don't need a massive centralized utility.
Yeah, all right, we're gonna go. But,
I'll come back.
So does that mean each of these big subdivisions in Puna could have their own, you know, electric system if their boards would put their noses to it?
The question is, could each community association have their own utility? The answer is yes. While HECO is a monopoly, they are not given an exclusive right to the island. Any other monopoly, electric monopoly, can coexist with them or carve out any section. So, for example, Pahoa could carve out a small utility, a small co-op, and take the power, provide it within the community. Aupuni could form their own co-op. You could encourage as many people as possible to leave the grid, and those that are in communities to form small co-ops to increase the reliability, decrease the cost, increase the democracy because you're controlling it locally, and decrease the fossil fuel and environmental footprints.
So who helps set that up here on this island? Is that part of this Hawaii Electric or somebody else?
I'm actually debating that right
Is it
now.
you?
I'm actually debating that right now, figuring out whether it would be better if, like the land, formed a subsidiary, or whether we formed a separate entity to encourage it.
If we leave our information, we're gonna get back.
Yes.
Uncle Red here has been waiting a long time.
Okay. Uncle? Yes, you.
You had your hand up.
Yes, Uncle.
My question is this, you use the word green very loosely. The term you use is like you're using the generator, transmission line, and a pump.
Right.
Then you bring in solar power, wind power, and all that, and you refer to grid. Now, what kind of grid is this?
The grid is everything between the generator and the customer. So all the wires. The traditional system, the old utility system, is that the electricity flows one way from the power plant to the customer. The modern way is going to either be a two-way flow of electricity. It's going to be like an internet, where anybody can add information, anybody can take out information, and you need some central command to control the two-way flows of electricity. or it's going to be people or small communities forming their own little blocks.
I work with generators myself.
Okay.
I know that generators, although it has a capability of producing X number of kilowatts, it does not put out all of that all the time.
You're right.
So, when you get wind power, solar power, all that going to the grid, regardless how much power is being put into the grid, it doesn't mean that all that power is going to be consumed by the public or business.
What do you?
Someplace along the way, there's gotta be some storage of some sort in order to kind of quell all of this so that you have a smooth flow all the time. Without that, you don't have a grid with a dam. Because you're gonna have more interruptions than it's worth.
You're absolutely right. And thank you for raising that, because I meant to put that into my initial speech. So thank you for raising that.
Well, you didn't explain it very well, so.
No, you're right, I didn't. You're right, I didn't. Right now, the storage on the US grid, if you take all the generators in the US and you turn them off instantly, and you measure the storage that exists on the US grid, it's about 1/10 of a second. It is not much better in Hawaii. We have very, very little storage. And so if you're going to add a lot of wind and a lot of solar, and you're going to maintain a grid, you're going to have to add a lot of storage. Within the United States, the major form of storage is called pump storage hydro, where you have two reservoirs, a lower one, a higher one and a lower one, and you pump water uphill through wind or solar, and you drop it when you need it. That accounts for over 90% of all the storage in the United States on the electric grid. The Big Island here has actually experimented with that on a drinking water reservoir on the west side of the island, where you have an upper and lower drinking water reservoir, and you can pump water uphill with wind or solar and drop it when you need it. And therefore, drinking water can supply a storage. But we have very, very little storage. And if you're going to add a lot of wind and solar, and you're going to stay on the grid, you're going to need massive amounts of storage. And right now, the utility on this island and on Maui are doing a lot of experiments. There are dozens of different batteries being tested in different places to see how storage can be added. But it's all in a very experimental stage right now.
But the old time Hawaiians used to pump water uphill to plant cattle, and they got away with it. They didn't need computers. They pumped the water, let the water flow uphill. And it's in their history book.
It is, and it would work on a small scale. I mean, if you look at the United States from 1850 to 1970, we had 6 million wind turbines. But they're all really small ones. They were for farms and homes, and even on Oahu, we had solar. We had wind farms in Oahu, and I think it was the 1830s. But it was small scale. Once you put massive amounts of wind and solar on a single grid, and you allow the electricity to flow in both directions, you need a massive computer system to coordinate it. You don't need it if it's very localized, if it's one farm, one community.
In Japan, they had underwater flow throughout the city of Tokyo, which is quite large. That came from an underground water flow. They go uphill, downhill, everything, underground. And it's distributed throughout the whole city of Tokyo. And they have water pumps where people can extract the water from this so-called water flow and pump it out right onto the street.
I will say that.
So I don't know what you're referring to when you say small operation in Maui or Lanai or wherever, because other people in other countries have done the same thing.
You're right. I was referring to the United States. There is a lot of innovation in other countries around the world that the United States takes a long time to figure out.
Well, the
For-
United States has not always been the leader in everything.
For example, England had electricity decades before Edison discovered it in the United States. So yes, a lot of places around the world are far ahead of the United States, or Hawaii, or Hawaii currently, the current government in Hawaii.
Some more questions on this side.
Yes.
You address the intergovernmental hearing docket, and do you think there'll ever be a political will to get that moving again? Has this been dormant?
The question is on wheeling. Wheeling is where, for example, a large wind farm can put in a generator and rent the grid to ship a certain amount of energy from their wind farm to a given customer. Wheeling has been tried in the mainland United States. The problem with doing it here is if the utility is trying to balance load and demand, and when you take energy that you're producing and you try to change their demand and supply curve, basically, to ship your energy to another customer, you will raise the rates that everybody else is paying. The proposal, for example, is, what if the wind farm was built on Lanai, and Murdoch proposed putting a cable to Kaneohe Marine Air Force Station, and that way you could Murdoch could sell his wind energy to the military, and the military could turn around and say to Hawaiian Electric, sorry, we don't want you anymore. And in fact, a transmission line could be built from the Marine base to Pearl Harbor, so that Pearl Harbor could also be taken offline. The problem with that is that because the wind blows some of the time and doesn't blow other parts of the time, the utility has to maintain all their generators for when the wind isn't blowing. So it adds costs to the utility plan. And somebody has to pay for that. And the people proposing wheeling are suggesting that the ratepayers absorb the added cost to run the utility generators.
But isn't that the same effect if people put solar on their house and have net energy metering, that they're taking money out of the utility's pocket and the utilities will raise the rates anyway?
Right, as the more net metering comes on,
They have the same effect.
and the more the grid destabilizes, the more the utility is finding, for example, for 50 years, they've mapped out the daily flow of energy on the grid. So they can say, for example, the maximum energy use on the Big Island occurs between 6 and 8 p.m. on some calm day between October and December. And they can say, on average, on a Tuesday at 3, this is the energy flow. As you add in a lot of customer net metering to the system, their patterns on how they expect the energy to flow are becoming heavily distorted, which means they have to begin adding extra fossil fuel reserves to handle the fact that they now don't understand the energy flows that are occurring, which is driving up their costs, which is driving up ratepayer costs, which is helping to drive up our energy bills. So HECO is actually right when they say, if you put a lot of solar on, it will drive up people's electric bills. And therefore, the trick is to say, yes, we're going to put the solar on, but we're going to disconnect from the grid. So when you try to raise the rates, it's not going to impact us.
As that happens, still the remaining people in the grid are going to have to.
Right, so the question is,
The people can't afford it.
the question is, can we do it fast? Can we simply get people off the grid really quickly? Say, like in 2 years, could we just say we're going to remove? And that's why if you did it through a utility that can lend the money, then it doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. If your current bill is less than what you're giving the utility, then anybody can go with it. And some places are trying that. Colorado is trying that, where They'll put in a system and it won't cost you any money up front. You just pay the bill, pay it down, you pay a monthly bill that is less than what you have now, and in 20 years you own the system. So if you're saving money every month, anybody can afford that.
If you'll